My rich boyfriend found out I was a lowly construction worker. I struggled to breathe as the spotlight seared down on me. My throat tightened and my heart pounded as if trying to escape my chest. "Introduce yourself," a voice called out from somewhere in the sea of people in front of me. I squinted, trying to make out the faces in the room, but all I could see was a sea of shadows, each one likely a privileged heir to some vast fortune, nepo babies whose lives had been laid out on a silver platter from birth. I knew the moment I revealed the truth that I was a construction worker and a scholarship student that my college life would end before it even began. The scorn, the ridicule, the isolation, it would all come flooding back. High school had been a nightmare I barely survived, and I came to college hoping for a fresh start. But here I was, put on the spot, about to be unmasked. My palms were sweaty, my mouth dry, the room waited, the silence pressing down on me like a vice. "Dude, you're holding up the introductions," Frida, my best friend and only friend in this hellhole, hissed in my ear. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to speak. With trembling hands, I raised the microphone to my lips and spoke. "Hi, everyone. I'm Simon. Simon Lewin." The room broke into hushed whispers the moment I said my name, and not for the reasons you might think. "Nobody gives a shit about your name. Who are your parents and what do they do?" Another loud voice from the back jeered as a few scattered laughs broke out from within the crowd. This was straight out of my worst nightmares. "You don't know who Simon is?" Frida asked, snatching the mic from me, trying to identify who had mocked me. "For your information, Simon here is Saudi Arabian royalty. His parents own the largest shipping corporations in Riyadh," Frida finished with a huff. The room went completely silent. If you listened closely, you would hear my heartbeat thumping at an all-time high. What the hell was Frida talking about? My parents weren't Saudi royalty. Hell, I didn't even have parents. I've been at the orphanage for as long as I can remember. What did she mean? Frida must have seen the panic in my eyes because she quickly grabbed my hand and tossed the mic to the nearest person. She power walked out of the hall, pulling me behind her and dividing the crowd of still stunned students. "We're out of here. This is a total waste of our time," she hissed, making a beeline for the exit. The entire room exploded into excited chatter. The moment the door shut behind us, I caught snippets of things like Saudi royalty and a real-life prince. Everyone in there was losing their minds over Frida's revelation, but I wouldn't stand for it. "Frida, what the hell?" I seethed, snatching my hands away from hers. "What do you mean, what the hell? I saved you from looking like a total tool in there. You should be thanking me, Simon." She placed her hands on her hips haughtily, a defiant frown on her face. "By lying to the entire school? How am I supposed to survive the next 4 years with them all thinking I'm royalty?" "Shh, settle down, Simon. Everyone there will be too drunk to remember any of this by morning. These things are nothing but preambles for ragers that'll last all night long," she said, blowing imaginary dust from her perfectly manicured nails. This was Frida in a nutshell. She was incredibly impulsive and argumentative. She hated to lose at anything and would go to extreme lengths to ensure things played out in her favor. "Frida, I really don't like this." Frida shrugged carelessly. "What's done is done, Simon. No need to cry over spilled milk." As though on cue, her chauffeur brought her outrageously lavish limousine to a stop in front of us. Frida hopped into the vehicle without missing a beat. "Come on, Simon, I'll drop you off." I considered her proposal for all of 5 seconds before declining. "No thanks, I'd rather walk." Frida was a proud woman. She was not one for repeating herself, much less begging. She slammed the door and the limo carefully drove off the curb and into the busy streets. With Frida gone now, all I had to do was slink back to my hostel without drawing much attention to myself, and hopefully this outrageous turn of events would be forgotten by morning. "Hey there, I'm sorry to bother you, but you're Simon Lewin, right?" A male voice suddenly spoke up behind me. I would have leapt at least 3 feet in the air if I wasn't already completely petrified. Maybe it wasn't me. I mean, Simon was a pretty common name, and so was my last name, Lewin. "I'm sorry, is this a bad time?" The person placed a hand on my shoulder, and I instinctively turned around at the contact. To my utter shock, it was none other than Timothy Baker. The Timothy Baker. He was the son of the most successful construction moguls in New York, and Timothy himself was the self-proclaimed king of our college. My heart rate spiked again, this time for a different reason. Timothy was agonizingly handsome, blonde hair, green eyes, tall, with strong shoulders. He looked like he belonged on magazine covers. Like everyone else on campus, I had a burning crush on him. The last thing I wanted was to talk to him, especially with Frida's lies still fresh in my mind. "Oh, hi, Timothy," I said slowly, trying to mask my panic with a weak smile. Timothy smiled back, and my heart did a flip. "I heard what Frida McNeil said back there. Pretty impressive background you have. I was wondering if we could discuss some business between our families." I felt the blood drain from my face. He actually believed Frida's story. I really need to get going." Timothy looked puzzled. Any other person would have jumped at the prospect of doing business with him. Timothy cleared his throat. "I understand you're busy, but this could be a great opportunity for both our families. Maybe we need to discuss it over coffee?" I was in full-blown panic mode. "I'm sorry, I really can't. I have a lot on my plate at the moment." I began walking away, needing to put as much distance between us as possible. Timothy looked taken aback but quickly recovered, hurrying to match my pace. "Look, I'm sorry if I came on too strong. Can we at least grab coffee? I promise it won't take long." I hesitated. "Coffee? How bad could that be?" Sure. Maybe tomorrow?" Timothy's eyes lit up. "Why not now?" Before I could process what he was implying, Timothy raised his hand and an expensive black car pulled out from where it was parked across the road. It rolled to a stop in front of us, and a butler stepped out holding the door open. I stared at the car, then stared back at Timothy. "You meant right now?" Timothy grinned. "Yeah, come on, it'll be fun." I took a deep breath and stepped towards the car. This was not how I imagined my day was going. 15 minutes later, Timothy's chauffeur drove us to one of the most expensive-looking penthouses in the city, and when we arrived, I discovered it was merely one of Timothy's many apartments scattered around the city. I must have looked completely shocked because Tim quickly apologized. "I really can't have a coffee in public places," he explained. "It's too, well, public, and I don't mix well with peasants," he smirked as he said it, but there was a hint of sincerity in his voice that made me cringe. What did he mean by peasants? I wanted to go off and educate him on how the people he so casually referred to as peasants were the very same people who tirelessly worked to make his family successful. I decided to let it go this time. I was about to go into the apartment after all, and I still had to play the part of the prince for now. As we stepped inside, I struggled not to gawk at the lavish door. The place screamed wealth and luxury. Timothy led me to a cozy seating area by a large window that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, feeling a bit out of place. "So, Simon," he began, handing me a cup of coffee. "Tell me more about your family's shipping business." I fumbled for a moment, trying to remember Frida's fabricated story. It's quite successful. We, handle a lot of international trade." Tim leaned in, his interest piqued. "That's fascinating. I've always been intrigued by international logistics." "Yeah? Well, not me. I'm not too big on business," I said, finally finding my footing and putting an end to the line of the conversation. We spent a few more minutes talking, just getting to know each other a little better, and I realized that despite Timothy's classist nature, he was actually a really sweet person. His bad habit of looking down on the less fortunate was something he had subconsciously learned from his parents, and as the hour passed, our conversation became a little more natural, and I found myself enjoying his company more than I could have ever expected. At one point, Tim scooted closer, his knee brushing against mine. I felt a burst of electricity at the contact. "You know, Simon," he said softly, "I've never met anyone quite like you. You're different." I looked at him surprised. "Different how?" Tim smiled, a rare hint of shyness in his eyes. "Different in a good way. You're genuine, and it's honestly refreshing." I didn't know how to respond. Here was Timothy Baker, the most sought-after guy in school, saying he found me refreshing? "Thanks, Tim. That means a lot coming from you." He stretched out his hand, and I accepted it. His touch was gentle but firm. "I mean it, Simon." I felt my cheeks heat up as he held my gaze. His eyes were so clear I could make out my reflection in them perfectly. I took that as my cue to leave, so I grabbed my stuff and Tim walked me to the elevator. Just as the doors were about to close, he put his hand in, stopping them. "I know it didn't start on the best note, but I enjoyed our conversation tonight, Simon. If you don't mind, I'd love for us to do it again sometime." I was ecstatic. "I'd love that, Tim." He smiled and took my number, then bid me goodnight as the elevator doors finally closed. 2 weeks later, Frida and I didn't believe it, but somehow Timothy Baker was actually interested in me. At first, Frida reasoned that Tim was only giving me the time of day because of my fabricated family wealth, and I strongly felt the same way. But as the days went by, I noticed him talking less and less about business and more about us as individuals. It shocked me that the Timothy Baker was going out of his way to make time to know me. Well, a fabricated version of me, but I'd take it nonetheless. The next 2 weeks were some of the most beautiful I had ever lived out. It started with harmless texts, then frequent coffee meetups, and even a private movie date after Tim insisted we go out more. He still wasn't a fan of mixing with the common folk and enclosed spaces, so he rented out an entire viewing room just for us. Back at work, Mr. Svensson finally gave me a raise and cleared me to work overtime to earn some more cash because thanks to Frida and her outrageous lie, the entire school now had their eyes on me. Every now and then I would hear them whisper something about the Saudi prince when I walked by. I wish they would stop already, or maybe even move on to hotter topics, but none was forthcoming. Turns out the average run-of-the-mill gossip didn't really pique the interest of the common folk. Well, if it isn't the Prince of Riyadh, Frida teased as her brand new Audi 5 rolled to a stop in front of me. I had just gotten off my shift at the site, and I slated to see Timothy in person for the first time this week, and Frida, being her magnanimous self, offered to give me a ride, sans her chauffeur. Frida had really taken responsibility for the situation she had created. She went out of her way to get me fancy clothes, shoes, and watches so I could at least look the part of the prince, and despite me turning her down the first few times, she kept sending the gifts directly to my hostel. Very funny, Frida. Just get me to Timothy on time, I sighed, strapping into the passenger seat. Yes, Your Highness. Frida gave me a mock salute before peeling off the curb at breakneck speeds. There was a reason her father insisted she had the chauffeur drive at all times. 20 minutes later, with Frida behind the wheel, the 45-minute trip from downtown back to the residential area was cut in half, and immediately she slowed down to a stop. I wasted no time getting out of the vehicle. Now be a good boy, Simon. Don't do anything I wouldn't do, she wiggled her fingers as she waved. Frida didn't even give me the chance to say anything. She reversed out of the tight corner she had parked and took off down the free road at frightening speeds. Hoping Frida would make it back to campus safely, I turned my attention to the park where I was supposed to meet Timothy. It wasn't hard finding him at all. I just had to spot the least populated area of the park, and there he was with his chauffeur walking his dogs. As I approached, Timothy's eyes lit up. He handed over the reins and met me halfway. On meeting up, we both hesitated, unsure whether to hug or shake hands. I stretched out my hand and Tim took it, looking a little downcast, but the awkwardness lasted only a few seconds. Feels like it's been ages, Simon. Glad to see you, Timothy said, gently patting my shoulder. We literally had lunch with Frida 3 days ago, I pointed out. Like I said, ages, Timothy smiled and began leading me down toward the lake. Tim had laid out a beautiful picnic for us. The setting was perfect. A cozy blanket spread on the grass, a basket filled with gourmet snacks, and his dogs now lounging nearby. This is really nice, man, I said, genuinely impressed. This was the first time I had seen him do something so down to earth. I'm glad you like it, he replied, his eyes sparkling. I tend to come here every now and then with the dogs. They seem to really like it here, and I think it has also grown on me. Nodding in understanding, I joined him as we settled onto the blanket. We eventually began eating and talking, enjoying the peaceful evenings as Tim's dogs played around us, adding to the relaxed atmosphere. Please tell me you heard the news flying around the architecture department, Tim asked, grinning. I laughed. No, what's the scoop? He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Apparently, Professor Henderson got into a heated argument with the dean over funding for his latest project. Word is, he threatened to quit. No way, I said, my eyes widening. Henderson's been with the department forever. I can't imagine him leaving. Tim nodded. I know, right? It's all anyone's been talking about, and then there's the whole saga with the new student rep. Did you know she's been lobbying for a complete overhaul of the student lounge? I chuckled. Yeah, I heard about that. She's got some pretty big ideas. It'll be interesting to see if she can pull it off. Timothy and I continued to trade insight on some of the matters going on around campus until the sun eventually began sinking well below the horizon. When it eventually got dark, Tim's chauffeur, Bertrand, started packing up the picnic. Without thinking, I got up and joined him, folding the blanket and gathering the leftover food. Tim noticed and chuckled. Simon, what are you doing? I shrugged, not really thinking about it. I can't just sit here and watch Bertrand do all the work. The people who raised me would have a fit if they caught wind of this. Tim's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with understanding. He joined in, albeit reluctantly, helping me with the cleanup. Were your parents too busy to raise you too? He asked softly as he joined me by the steak dishes. Oh, I didn't get to meet my... I immediately froze. I remembered the ruse Frida had cooked up and stammered. Yeah, something like that. We finished packing up and Bertrand loaded everything into the car. As we turned to go our separate ways for the night, Tim and I had a moment of sorts. I reached out for a handshake, but Tim took my hand, and rather than just shake it, he pulled me close. Brown eyes met green as we stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but in reality, it was anything but that. After a few seconds of pause, our faces began inching closer, and I couldn't believe it. I was about to kiss Timothy Baker. Just as our lips were about to meet, the car's headlights came around and Bertrand drove into view, breaking the spell. Tim released my hand and stepped back, a sheepish smile on his face. I guess I'll see you around, Simon, he said, his voice softer than it had been all evening. Yeah, see you soon, I replied, my heart still racing from the almost kiss. The next day. The following day, I went through work at the construction site with the near kiss replaying in my mind. I wanted to kiss Tim so badly, but my conscience kept nagging at me, reminding me that I was lying to him about who I really was. When Frida stopped by to pick me up in yet another new car, she caught me spacing out. What's the problem? She asked as I climbed in. I sighed, trying to find the right words. Last night with Timothy, it was intense. We almost kissed. Her eyes widened. Almost? What happened? Bertrand, his chauffeur, showed up at the worst possible moment, I explained, shaking my head. But it's not just that. I've been lying to Tim about who I am. It's starting to eat at me. Frida looked thoughtful for a moment before asking, Do you really like Tim? I do, I admitted. I've seen a version of Tim I didn't think existed. He's sweet and caring, and I really like him. Then you need to be honest with him, Simon. Honesty is the best policy, especially when it comes to matters of the heart. Before things get too serious, you should come clean. I felt a surge of frustration. All of this wouldn't be happening if you hadn't lied in the first place, I snapped. She didn't flinch. If I hadn't stepped in, you would have probably withdrawn from college by now. I know these people. They would have made you miserable. I did what I had to do to help you, Simon. Her words stung, but I knew she was right. I had to come clean to Tim, no matter how difficult it would be. I know, I muttered. I just hope he can forgive me. You won't know until you try, Frida said gently as she put the car back in gear and sped off. The next day, I spent all my time at school trying to find a moment alone with Tim, but our schedules were just too different. With him being an anthropology major and me being an architecture major, I was beginning to think I'd have to wait another day when my phone buzzed with a text from Tim inviting me to a study group in the library later that night. I had hung out with Tim's friends a couple of times before, and they were mostly cool, so I didn't mind. When evening came, I made my way to the library and joined Tim and his friends at a larger table. We were deep into our books and notes when Clarissa's older brother Xander stopped by to pick her up. Xander saw me and didn't hide his interest. He blatantly flirted, making comments and trying to get my number. Tim stepped in, obviously annoyed. Simon is already spoken for, he said, his tone firm. Xander's smirk didn't leave his face. I'd like to hear that from Simon himself, he replied. I didn't bother thinking over it much. It's true, I told Xander, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm already spoken for. Xander finally backed off, but not before giving me one last lingering look. As he left with Clarissa, I felt a strange mix of relief and pride. Later that night, as Tim and I walked back home side by side, while Tim broke the silence. I'm sorry for lying, he said quietly. Jealousy gets the best of me sometimes. I couldn't help but tease him a little. Jealousy? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Tim realized he divulged too much and stopped walking, forcing me to stop too. He took a deep breath and looked me in the eyes. Thing is, I feel things for you, Simon, he confessed. Oh, is that so? Tell me, Timothy, what are these things you feel? I teased lightly. I watched as a range of emotions coursed through Timothy before he eventually bit his lower lip in frustration. It's a little hard to put into words all at once. Then tell me what you feel right now, in this very moment. What I want, Timothy repeated the words as though he was trying them out for the first time. I want nothing more than to kiss you right now. I smiled. See? That wasn't so hard. Tim cut me off with a kiss. It seemed like I had teased him a little too much. His lips were soft, warm, and inviting. I wasted no time in kissing him back wholeheartedly. I could care less if the entire world was watching. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless. Come home with me, Timothy whispered, his cheeks tinged red from the exchange. Against my better judgment, I took Timothy's hand and we flagged down a taxi so we could pick this up in the privacy of his apartment. 3 days later. Despite our amazing night together, Timothy and I weren't chanced to see much of each other because of our conflicting class schedules. But by the end of the week, as I was about to clock out from work, I got a call from Tim. Hey Simon, it's been a crazy week, I know, but I've booked dinner at my favorite place, he said, excitement clear in his voice. I'll swing by your hostel to pick you up at 8? Isn't 8 a bit late? I asked, glancing at the time. Yeah, I know, and I'm sorry, Timothy admitted, but I have to inspect one of my father's businesses somewhere in town first. I'll come get you right after. When I got off the call, I quickly dialed Frida to fill her in. Ever since the encounter a few nights ago, I had made it my point of duty to fill her in on every detail. Frida, you're not going to believe this, but Tim just called. He's taking me to dinner tonight. That's amazing! You lovebirds finally made time out to see one another. Frida's voice drops a bit. Have you told him the truth yet? I sighed in mild annoyance. Not yet, but I plan on telling him tonight. That's what you said last time, Simon, and the time before that. The sooner you fill him in, the better, Frida reiterated, her tone serious. I know, I sighed, I know. Anyways, good luck with your date. After hanging up, I put my phone in my locker. I began changing out of my construction gear. I had barely undone the zipper of my jumpsuit when the manager barged in out of breath. There's an impromptu inspection, he yelled. The locker room erupted into chaos as the workers who had already started changing into their regular clothes, like me, scrambled to get dressed again. Come on, boys, look alive. They'd be here any minute now. Mr. Svensson rushed us. The words had barely left his mouth when the locker room door swung open, and I came face to face with none other than Timothy Baker, flanked by 2 serious-looking lawyers. My heart stopped as our eyes locked for a few terse seconds before Tim turned around and left, asking the lawyers to finish the inspection on his behalf with a simple wave of his hand. I wanted to rush after him, but the manager's intense gaze rooted me to the spot. There was no way I could leave in the middle of an inspection, especially not in the company's uniform. The inspection was a quick one. It took an entire hour, and by the time I had changed and rushed out of the site, Tim was long gone. 1 month later. I didn't see Tim for the whole month. After he discovered my workplace, I took a week's leave so I could focus on finding him. With Frida's help, I searched everywhere. We tried to gain access to Tim's apartment, but we were turned away. He was nowhere to be found on campus either. Tim's friends were no help at all. When I approached them, they shrugged and told me that Tim had a habit of disappearing from time to time. You shouldn't worry about it too much, they said. No one can find him if he doesn't want to be found. That didn't sit well with me. How could I not worry? I felt like I'd blown my chance with him. Every day without Tim made the knot in my stomach tighten. It wasn't just about losing a romantic interest. I missed the person who had quickly become one of the most important parts of my life. Despite the assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I replayed our last interaction in my mind, I was reminded of the look in Tim's eyes, a cruel mix of hurt and betrayal. It gnawed at me, making it hard to focus on anything else. Eventually, I had to return to work. I could only mooch off Frida for so long, and it was precisely the day I had to return that something phenomenal happened. It was about noon one afternoon, and our scheduled break was right around the corner when Mr. Svensson, in his usual boisterous manner, announced a new worker joining them. At first, I didn't pay much attention. People come and go at construction sites all the time, but this announcement was different. The other workers were unusually rowdy and chattering more than usual, which made it really difficult to concentrate. Eventually, my curiosity piqued, and I decided to check out what all the ruckus was about. When I turned around to see what was going on, I couldn't believe my eyes. Timothy Baker was standing there in a construction uniform, disgust written all over his face, as Mr. Svensson explained his new duties to him. 5 hours later. After seeing Tim in a construction uniform, our construction uniform, as in the one his father owned, I was in too much shock to approach him. The entire day passed in a blur, and it wasn't until we were in the changing room at the end of the day that I found myself close enough to him to talk. I hovered near him, trying to muster the courage to say something. Tim noticed me out of the corner of his eye and said, "If you have something to say, just come out with it." "I'm sorry, Tim," I started, but he cut me off. "You lied to me for weeks, Simon," he said sternly. "I don't understand why you felt the need to do that. I was livid at first, and I still am, but I've gained a little insight from Bertrand. It's one of the reasons I'm here. I needed to understand what life is like for people like you." For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things could be salvaged, but Tim quickly shattered that hope. "I haven't forgiven you," he continued, "and for the next few weeks that I'm here, I'd appreciate it if you stay out of my way." With that, he finished changing and walked out, leaving me standing there gobsmacked. The realization hit me hard. Tim was still angry, and things were far from resolved. 2 weeks later. The following week was filled with frosty silence from Tim. I hated how he was so close, yet felt completely out of reach. Every time I saw him, I wanted to apologize, but the icy wall he'd built around himself was impenetrable. The other members of the crew stayed away from Tim too. He wasn't friendly and would always tell everyone off who tried to get too close. I felt responsible for that. I had made things difficult for him. At the end of the week, I joined a late-night shift to remodel an office building. To my surprise, Tim was also on the crew. We went through the motions of avoiding each other, our interactions limited to curt nods and silent glances. As the night wore on and the crew dwindled, Tim and I were among the last two left on the site. Just as I was about to head to the bus stop, Tim approached me. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of hope and dread churning inside me. "Simon," he said, his voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." I nodded, unsure of what to expect. This was the first time he'd willingly spoke to me in weeks, and I didn't want to mess it up. As I got closer, the cold look on his face melted away and I could see exhaustion that belied his age and social status. "I thought I could last a month," Tim confessed, his voice strained. "But it's impossible. This has been the hardest weeks of my life." He looked at me, his eyes softer than they'd been in weeks. "As much as I hate to say it, I've gained a lot of respect for people like you, Simon, and the way you all survive. It doesn't make any sense, and I am absolutely disgusted with myself with how I've treated you all. I'd like to formally apologize." My eyes widened in surprise. "Tim? Apologize? You were more likely to catch Frida taking a bus than for Tim Baker to apologize to a peasant." No, you don't have to." Tim raised his hands, halting me, his frown returning. "My apology has nothing to do with what you did, Simon. It's not a pass, but to a small margin, I understand." I took a deep breath. Feeling this way was my only chance to finally explain myself. "Tim, I'm really sorry. The pressure at the school mixer got to me. I never planned to lie to you or anyone else. After Frida said what she said, I just wanted to get through the night and put it behind me, but then I bumped into you." I paused, trying to find the right words. "I know now that I should have been honest from the get-go, and I can't change the fact that I wasn't. But I can tell you this, Tim." I took a deep breath. "What I feel for you is one of the most honest emotions I've ever felt." Tim's expression softened, significantly. It looked like he was mentally debating with himself, but then he looked away for a moment before meeting my eyes again. With a resigned sigh, "Look, man, if I'm being honest, it's not just your lie that's pissing me off. I was angry because I found myself ready to forgive you so easily, and it didn't make any sense." I felt a surge of hope and stepped closer. "Tim, He cut me off again, but gently this time. "I don't know if we can get back to where we were, but this doesn't have to be the end for us." He extended his hand toward me, a tentative smile on his face. "Let's start over. Be friends first, and see where it goes from there." I stared at his hand for a moment, wondering if I really had it in me to be friends with him, despite all he made me feel. But then the decision was a fairly easy one. "I'd like that, Tim." Tim's smile grew, and he reintroduced himself. "Well, in that case, hi, I'm Timothy Baker. The Timothy Baker." I chuckled, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders a bit. "It's nice to meet you, Timothy. I'm Simon Lewin, construction worker and scholarship student." It takes about a month and a few weeks of friendship for Timothy and I to move past our former situation and rekindle our spark. Frida, on the other hand, made a public apology in school, and news that I was not in fact Saudi royalty spread like fire throughout the campus. Strangely enough, I didn't get bullied for it. There were the occasional jokes here and there, but no one really messed with me, not when I had Timothy Baker and Frida McNeil in my corner. The end. What do you think about Simon's situation? Would you go along with Frida's lies if you were in his place? Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force, and stay wholesome.